Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Research Rundown, new findings on timely topics in leadership, coaching, and development. This is our first webinar of 2021, and we're really excited to have you here. My name is Lucy Sullivan, and I'm going to be your host for today from MRG. And before we begin, just a quick bit of housekeeping. We are recording today's webinar, so you will get a link to the recording, to the slides. We'll do a blog post with a summary of a lot of the key points we covered and answers to questions that we didn't get a chance to cover. So you'll get all of that. This is a 75-minute webinar, which is new and different for us. So if you have to hop off 15 minutes early for a meeting or anything, we will get you all those materials afterwards. So don't worry too much. And of course, as this is a webinar with a nice big audience, your mics and your cameras are off, but we absolutely want to hear from you throughout the webinar. So you've probably all spent plenty of time on Zoom in recent months, but you just navigate to that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can send questions to us at any point throughout the webinar. We will pause a few times throughout to answer those questions, but you can pop them in as they come to you. I'm sure we probably won't have time to get to quite every question that gets asked today, but we keep track of all of them, and we'll make sure that you get answers afterwards, again, in that blog or sent to you personally. So do look out for that. And I will give you a brief introduction of who MRG is and who's going to take us through this webinar today. So MRG is a global leader in designing assessments that impact people in profound and meaningful ways. We have solutions for leadership, personal development, motivation, sales, service. They're insightful, they're research-backed instruments. You'll hear a lot about our research today. And they're designed with action-inspiring feedback in mind to help people get that deeper level of self-awareness and encourage them to pursue lasting growth. We were founded more than 35 years ago, coming up on 40 probably, and our assessments have been used by thousands of certified practitioners in more than 100 countries around the world. Many of you are joining us today. And we have two presenters today. Our primary presenter is Maria Brown, who's our head of research here at MRG. And she brings a tremendous energy for research to us. She has a PhD from Vanderbilt. She's conducted award-winning research on educational practices, and she's presented for SCP, the Society of Consulting Psychology, European Mentoring and Coaching Council, EMCC, and many more. And you'll also hear a little bit here and there from Tricia Naddaff, who's the president here at MRG, and she's been working with individuals, teams, and organizations for more than 30 years in consulting and coaching, product design, research as well. And she shares MRG research and learnings around the world. You may have seen her as a TEDx speaker at ATD, also at SCP, in many places. So they're both very eager to share a lot of this content with you today, and we're just so happy to be back with you all in the new year. So with that, I will hand things over.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And hi and welcome everyone to our first webinar of the year. We're very excited. We have a lot to talk about today. So 2020 was a long and quite unique year, but somehow we managed to do a lot of research here at MRG. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So there are three main areas that we want to go over. We're going to talk about something we've been getting a lot of questions about, leadership trends during the pandemic. What has changed, what hasn't, and what do we do with it? We're also going to talk about working remotely and particularly leading remotely. What are remote leaders doing that's different from those who work more in person or on site? And then finally, we are going to talk a little bit about our new we've already looked at this, but we're digging a little bit deeper into diversity and inclusion. And we're going to talk not just about it in general terms, but we're going to talk about interactions between self and observer identity. So we're very excited to share with you what we found in these three areas, but we're also excited to share what's next, right? What's MRG research going to look like this year in 2021, and what we're planning on doing beyond this year. So before I get started with that, I would like to introduce Tricia, my co-presenter, and she's going to tell you a little more about our goals for today.
Thanks, Maria. Hello, all. I add my welcome to Lucy's and Maria's. So for those of you who've been hanging around us a while, you know that research is a big part of MRG's commitment to helping people gain insights, to grow and to learn. And for us, research isn't not a once in a while thing. It's an everyday ongoing thing. And so anytime we present research to you. It's a snapshot in time. For those of you who've been tracking our research, you know, for example, we've done generational research for decades now and gender research for decades now. So we are tracking the story of leadership over time through the research lens. Just a reminder, we have a very strong philosophy about our research. When we present research, we never present it as a prescription. Our research isn't meant to tell you what's right or wrong, what you should do or not do. It's meant to create a place for a deeper dialogue, in some cases, a broader dialogue with those leaders that you're working with, sometimes with ourselves. Right, so this is a sample of some of the great research that Maria has been leading us through over the last year, and as always, to be continued. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Tricia, and thank you for sharing that. It's an ongoing conversation, and that's what makes it so much fun. So let's jump into the first topic for today. This is something that's in everyone's mind, it seems like. So let's look at what, if anything, has changed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, before we talk about any specifics, I wanted to say a little bit about the assessment we're going to use for most of the research that we're going to talk about today, because I believe most of you are familiar with the LEA, but not everyone will be. So the LEA 360 is a multi-rater leadership assessment that measures 22 leadership behaviors. The behaviors are observable and specific so that leaders and their observers can easily interpret and identify them. And importantly, the LEA provides a description of a leader's behavior. It doesn't endorse any behaviors as better than others, but it actually just helps describe a leader in neutral terms that reflect what they truly are doing in their role. Now, in addition to those 22 behaviors, the LEA Observer Questionnaire includes 31 leadership competency items. In these items, observers rate leaders' effectiveness. And these are actually evaluative, and they provide a leader with feedback about how effective they are in their role. Now, we will be drawing from both of these parts of the LEA, these two types of question in the research that we're going to cover during today's webinar. So let's get started. Now, one thing, we like to share how we approach the research. And the pandemic affected different parts of the world differently, in particular when it comes to timing. And so our approach to this was to take samples regionally so that we can ensure that at least most people in that sample experienced the pandemic similarly. They were going through kind of the same issues, same stages of the pandemic. Of course, there's going to be some variability within regions, but it's as close as we can get to a similar experience. Now, our dive into this research asked two main questions, comparing leadership in 2020 to leadership in the previous 2 years. First, we looked at whether there are differences in the behaviors most emphasized by leaders in 2020 compared to 2018 and 2019. And then we looked at whether there are differences in how leaders convey effectiveness in 2020 compared to 2018. Now, when you think about your own experience this year, how much do you feel that leadership has changed in 2020 compared to 2018 and 2019? A, do you expect to see a lot of significant changes? B, maybe some small changes? Or C, I don't expect to see any changes at all. And I see that Lucy has started the poll, so we'll wait.
I have, and yeah, votes are coming in fast. Excited to see how this turns out. All right, we'll give it just another second. Give everyone a chance to guess. All right, thanks everyone. And let's see those results. So 51% said they expect to see a lot of significant changes, and 47% expect to see some small changes, and just 3% are expecting things to stay the same.
Thank you, Lucy. So that's very interesting. So most of you expect to see at least some changes in leadership, but then it's evenly split between a lot of significant changes and small changes. Well, we're about to share what we have, but you will see that depending on how we slice the data, both of those are correct. But let's start with our broader research looking at these larger regions. Now, before I dive into the specifics, and I'm going to start sharing some of the differences we found, I'm going to have to say that, at least for this initial part of the studies that we conducted, what we found were significant differences, at least in terms of statistics, but they had small effect sizes. What this means is we will see some differences, but the actual mean score difference is not that big. And this would suggest that we're seeing some soft signals of change and adjustment in these results, but there's still no strong push for making big changes in what we're doing in light of the pandemic. But we'll get to talk about that a little more once we share the results. Okay, so I think I skipped one. There we go. Okay, so here's the first result. So this is looking at LEA self data, so looking at self-perceptions from leaders in the United States. Okay, remember that we're going by region, and the first region we're going to look at is the United States. The question we asked here is, did leaders behave differently in 2020 compared to previous years? So not surprisingly, we did see some significant differences. And the first one we noticed was in Q2, the second quarter of 2020, we saw an increase in self-perceptions of delegation. Okay. Now, delegation has to do with it not just enlisting the talents of others to help them meet objectives, but also giving them sufficient autonomy to exercise their own judgment, right? So letting them, actually delegating and letting them take charge of some of those tasks. And Q2 is, at least for the US, when most of us were leaving our offices to work from home. And perhaps we were starting to feel that need to give others more leeway and more space when we delegated to them. With delegation after the second quarter, it seems to be dropping back to normal levels. So what we saw with this behavior is a slight increase in the second quarter and a gradual leveling off and dropping back to normal levels towards the end of the year. Another change that we saw with our US sample is in the final quarter of 2020. So leaders saw themselves as placing less emphasis on leading in a dominant or forceful way. They were less seeing themselves as less competitive and assertive. And this is happening at the end of 2020 after a lot of months going through this new way of leading, new set of rules and challenges. So there could be something here with exhaustion after almost a year of working this way. It may also be related to the other change that we saw, and that is a higher self-perception of empathy. So leaders saw themselves as placing more emphasis on showing concern for others, on making sure they're taking care of the needs of others, and forming supportive relationships. And this is not surprising. When something this big happens, I think a lot of us would like to see ourselves as being more helpful and there for others. So when we look at the three trends we found in the US, we see that leaders saw themselves as placing more emphasis on delegation, more emphasis on empathy, and less on being dominant and forceful in their leadership. Interestingly, these were self-perceptions. Observers did not see the same trends. In fact, if you look at just observer scores and observer perceptions, leadership behaviors in the US in 2020 were not different from 2018 or 2019, right? So only the self seems to be noticing this. And I'll say a little more about that, but first I want to share a little bit about a different region. We looked at Europe as well. And Europe is a little less homogeneous than the US in terms of the pandemic, but it's again, we were trying to find a similar of an experience as possible. So it's a fairly large region to be looking at this. Interestingly, we saw changes in three behaviors as well. So European leaders in 2020 saw themselves as placing more emphasis on considering the long-term implications of their decisions, or being more strategic. They saw themselves as placing less emphasis on structuring or taking a methodical and systematic approach to work. I mean, who isn't? And then finally, European leaders saw themselves as less likely to emphasize deference to authority, or less likely to rely too much on the opinions of those in positions of authority. So as in the US sample, this was self-perceptions, and we did not see the same changes in observer perception. So again, for observers, leadership looked the same in 2020, 2018, and 2019. At least the behaviors that were emphasized most did not change in significant ways. We are still working on this. Tricia mentioned, our research is ongoing, and we want to dig a little deeper as to why there are changes in self and not observer perceptions. And so there are several possibilities that hopefully we'll be able to answer down the road as we collect more data. But one possibility is that people are more aware of how much things have changed for them, right? It takes longer to recognize change in others because you have so much more recent data about what's going on with you versus perhaps a colleague you haven't seen in a few months. There's so much more information available when you think about what you're doing differently. Another possibility, and if this is the case, actually, we might see observer perceptions catch up as they start to collect more data, more experiences with other leaders, and they're able to see where the changes are starting to happen. Another possibility is that with everything that's going on, we might be a little more self-focused than before and not even notice that change in others. There's a lot going on, right? And there's perhaps little cognitive space to focus on others. Finally, we may be thinking differently, and we think that leads to changes in how we behave, but that doesn't necessarily happen immediately, right? So perhaps I may be thinking less about procedure and structure or being very methodical in what I'm doing, but in reality, my external behavior has not changed, right? So other people wouldn't be noticing that my thoughts are slightly different right now. So we will be continuing to look at these data to see what else might be going on, and maybe get a little more clarity as to why we're seeing changes in some areas but not others. Now, the last region that I wanted to talk about in terms of LEA changes in behaviors and leadership behaviors is Asia Pacific. What's interesting about Asia Pacific is we saw one behavior change, and that is an increase in emphasis on empathy. But in this case, this was seen in observer perceptions and not in self-perceptions. Okay, so it's a reversal in who is noticing the difference. So far, we have looked at three different regions, and we've looked at what leaders might be doing differently in 2020 compared to the previous 2 years. Now, the other question that we wanted to talk about today was, are there differences in how leaders convey effectiveness? Now, in the LEA 360, observers rate leaders on different competencies, 31, as I mentioned earlier. And one of these is overall leadership effectiveness. So we wanted to know, do leaders need to do anything differently to be seen as effective in 2020? Okay, is there a different formula for looking effective in 2020? So we used a US sample of LEA 360 participants to answer this question. And it turns out that there weren't many differences. Effective leaders were doing pretty much the same things in 2020 that they did in the last 2 years. The only difference that we found is that in the second half of 2020, the most effective leaders were emphasizing higher levels of excitement, right? And excitement has to do with operating with high levels of energy and intensity, and getting that intensity gets other people enthusiastic and involved in the work. And so this started to happen at some point around July, right? Third and fourth quarter, second half of the year. What's interesting about this is that excitement is typically important for effectiveness in the first quarter of the year, not in the second half of the year. Okay? It never shows up in that, or rarely ever shows up in that second half of the year. So it might be that with everything that's going on, that same energy that leaders use to get others excited at the beginning of the year is being employed to keep things moving at a rapid and an exciting pace during the pandemic. And so effective leaders are using excitement and high levels of energy to keep their teams enthusiastic and involved in the work. So when we put this all together, and I kind of hinted at this earlier, we're seeing small differences in behaviors, right? We see statistically significant differences, but in effect or practical terms, they're not very big. And they're mainly in self-perceptions, with the exception of the Asia Pacific group. There are some regional nuances where the same behaviors don't change in every region. And when we look at leadership effectiveness, there's one difference in how US leaders convey effectiveness. So what, small differences, nuances, just one difference in conveying effectiveness, these are small adjustments that we're seeing in leadership. We're not seeing great big changes. And this, I know a lot of us expected to see big changes in leadership, but this isn't the first time that this has happened. And I'm going to invite Tricia to talk about her experience looking for this after 9/11 in the US and during the Great Recession. I think leadership remained fairly stable at that time. Leadership practices appear to be more stable than we tend to think. So Tricia, do you have anything to add, or would you?
Thanks, Marie. Yes, I do. This is, I'm thinking, Marie, of how many times you and I were pouring through this results, looking and seeing blips and then not seeing them sustain. So, but this has happened several times over the MRG's history. We started looking at this first after the economic downturn in the early 90s. We had a recession then, and we all expected to see some changes. We looked at it in after that post 9/11 space. We also took another look again. Some of us may remember in 2002 and 2003, there were a lot of ethical violations that were very, very public. And so we looked at it then. We looked at it after what we for some reason are calling the Great Recession. And of course, now with a global pandemic. And it has been the same every time that we see smaller differences. And it is historic that when we talk about leadership, what we want, what we hope for, what we feel is needed, what we feel it should be the change that comes about, we always talk about it in revolutionary terms, right? Now is the time, now this is needed. But in fact, leadership changes at a much more evolutionary pace. It's a much slower go. And certainly it's a much slower go to see it happen over broad sections of the population. I just want to remind us all from a neuroscience perspective, when individuals are stressed or overwhelmed, then what in fact happens is we revert more to our habitual patterns of behavior. So even why the prefrontal cortex, the more sort of conscious, newer part of the brain may be saying, we need to do things differently. When I'm actually in the swell of the work and I'm stressed and overwhelmed and uncertain, that habitual pull is powerful. So all of the things, that we've noticed, that we tend to be more acute observers of our own way of engaging. We tend to be pretty unreliable observers of subtle, even sometimes moderate changes in behavior, particularly if they're new. And often for it to really settle into an observer mindset, we need to see it for a long time. So it overwrites the brand we have given this person around their behavior and what we expect to see. So even though we keep looking, there are a lot of reasons why we don't see the dramatic change in behavior that sometimes we could imagine would emerge out of a dramatic context change. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Tricia. And of course, yeah, we expected to see big differences. It was initially a little disappointing, but then you take a step back and you realize it really doesn't need to change that much. But of course, we kept looking, and we decided to take a look at other cuts of the data. Especially, we wanted to know what happens when you take a more narrow slice of the leadership population and ask the same two questions asked before. So here, for example, is a look at the healthcare industry in the U.S. This is, comparing healthcare leaders in 2020 to 2018 and 2019, and we want to ask, are they behaving differently? And we asked, are they conveying effectiveness in different ways? I will tell you right now that these differences were bigger than what we saw in the multi-industry samples that we just talked about, right? So looking at things regionally gave us small effect sizes. Looking at things with a narrower slice actually showed more practically significant differences between 2020 and the previous years. So let's see what those are. So in 2020 compared to 2018 and 2019, healthcare leaders were perceived by their observers as placing less emphasis on self or less emphasis on making decisions independently, being more autonomous than they were in the previous 2 years. And as I said before, this was a statistically significant difference, but it was also a larger effect size. So it actually means something in practical terms. We also found that observers noticed that leaders in 2020 were placing more emphasis on communication. And the MRG or the LEA measure of communication has to do with clarity of communication, being clear in your expressing your thoughts and expressing your expectations and maintaining that constant flow of information. So these two behaviors where we saw differences in healthcare aren't that jaw-dropping, right? It's not surprising that being less autonomous when making decisions and maintaining lines of communication open would be important, or would become more evident, more prevalent in this industry at this time. However, unlike what we saw in a lot of the previous studies, this change was only present in observer perceptions. There were no differences in self-perception. Of course, there's more to dive into, but perhaps this might be a sample or an example of a group of leaders that is a little less self-focused and more other aware, right? They might be relying on each other more because of the current context that they're working in. Another thing that was interesting about this sample is that we found something we didn't see in any of the regional cuts of the data. Healthcare leaders were rated higher on board leadership competencies in 2020 when we compared to average ratings in 2018 and 2019. So they were seen as higher on credibility with management, with peers, and with direct reports, higher on being straightforward, being candid, open communicators, and they were rated as having greater future potential, right? So it's possible that during this time of high stress and high focus, healthcare leaders were more reliable at delivering on promises, right, which increases their credibility for multiple audiences and multiple groups. They were forthright and candid about what was happening, making them seem like more open communicators. And when you take this all and what they're doing now, it may make them seem like future leader material, right? So their future potential scores go up. So when we look at this smaller sample, what we're seeing is bigger and more meaningful shifts in leadership in a more specific context. And so what this makes me think about is, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence from conversations that we've had with clients and network members, where people are seeing differences in their practice when they're working with individual leaders or groups of leaders, or even at the organizational level. When you get a smaller, more homogeneous sample, where a lot of the changes, the variability doesn't cancel itself out, you might see a few more changes in how people are leading, and what's important for leadership. So I think we have a few minutes, or a minute or two, for questions. So I'm going to ask Lucy to jump in and let us know what we have.
Thanks so much. Yes, some great questions are coming in. Keep them coming throughout the presentation. One quick one for clarification, Maria. When we talk about leaders, can you just explain what we mean by that? Are you talking about just CEOs or senior level, or who's included in that?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. So we use all management levels in our database. So that includes all the way to, so leaders all the way up to the president or CEO level. It also has some department heads, leaders of functions. So it's a large range of leadership roles within organizations.
Thank you. And one more interesting question came in. Is it possible, so we saw in a lot of these data sets that there was no change in observer perceptions. Do we think it's possible at all that could be accounted for by a delay or a slowness in people's observing the changes that their leaders are making, that maybe there are differences in behaviors, but there's a delayed observation effect?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I caution myself, because that's what I said when we didn't find a lot of things at the beginning, and it's like eventually something will show up. So I'm hoping that we will see something in maybe some soft signals, at least in observer perceptions, because it might take longer to notice that behaviors have changed in others. It's easier to see how things have changed for you, because you have full access to your thoughts, to what you're doing on a regular basis, and you have less access to what others are doing on a regular basis. And so, if it is the case that these things are that these behaviors are changing, and it's a matter of others noticing, we will start to see those changes show up in the data in the coming months. And this is ongoing, so we will definitely keep checking for that.
Thanks. In the interest of time, let's move on. And folks, you are welcome to keep those questions coming in the chat box. If we don't get to them during the broadcast, we will make sure to follow up afterwards. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. And thanks for those questions. Please share them, because we always get to them either here or a little later, and we share the answers with you. So the next thing we wanted to talk about is leading remotely. So MRG has received a lot of questions about pandemic changes, but a related topic, and one that we hear a lot about, have heard a lot about recently, is remote work. So people want to know whether there is a difference to leading remotely than leading in person. Fortunately, we added a remote work question to our demographics questionnaire this year. It was in the works, but I think the pandemic and everything that was going on was just the push we needed to actually add that item to our demographics questionnaire. And it measures not just whether someone works remotely at all, but it also measures how often, on average, people work remotely. And so we used a global sample of leaders. The question was added in 2020, so we're looking at data starting somewhere in mid-2020 to current, to right now. We have LEA Self and LEA 360 or LEA Observer data, and we were able to break leaders into 3 groups: those who work remotely 0 days a week, those who work remotely on average 1 to 2 days a week, and then those who work remotely 3+ days a week. And we took these groups to compare kind of what we've been doing so far. Are there differences in the behaviors that are emphasized by remote leaders when compared to those who are on site? What we found is that there were no differences in those who work 1 to 2 days a week, and between those who work 1 to 2 days a week and those who work 3+ days a week. Okay. So The results that you're seeing here are just a comparison between leaders with any level of remote work compared to leaders who work fully in person. Okay, so in person all the time versus some level of remote work. Uh, Leaders who work remotely at any level see themselves as placing less emphasis on structuring or working in a methodical manner and following procedures more strictly. And they see themselves as placing less emphasis on deference to authority, okay, or using authority figures within the organization as sources of information and guidance. That same group of those leaders who work remotely at any level, also saw themselves as placing more emphasis on being persuasive or building commitment and winning people over to their point of view, and higher emphasis on delegation. And we've already talked about that. It's not just about delegating, but giving some level of autonomy to those we are delegating to. Uh, and none of these findings are surprising. We would expect that those who work remotely would be less reliant on structure and authority figures, if only because of the distance. They may need to delegate more in ways that give others autonomy. Also, I mean, the distance and the level of contact that they may have with their direct reports and others. But there are a lot of questions here, in particular about the directionality or the cause of these differences. So, does working remotely lead you to see yourself higher in structuring, or does being higher on structuring make you more likely to work remotely? Right? Now, there's a lot left here to look at, but this is we're just starting to look at this. This is a small data set. We started with about 1,000 participants, but it's growing. It's growing every day, and every time I check the database, we have another 100 or so participants. So this is an area we're going to continue to look at. And as we collect more data from people at different management levels, different industries, different functions, we might be able to figure out a lot of those causal relationships. Now, when it comes to self-perceptions, it was good. One of I think the promising findings that we saw was that there was no difference in self-ratings of self-confidence, growth mindset, or authenticity in role for people working in any of these three levels, right? So no difference between no remote work at all versus 1 to 2 days versus 3+ days a week. Uh, and this is important and reassuring because these are positive mindsets, and we wouldn't, want to see one group be a little lower than the other in that. We also saw no difference in observer perceptions of leadership behaviors or leadership impact. And what's really important about this is that because there were no differences in leadership impact, this suggests that leaders are seen as equally effective in all three work arrangement groups. Right? So it's not that you're a more effective leader when you're on site or when you just work 1 to 2 days a week and at a remote level. There were no differences in how effective leaders were. But despite that, we still wanted to look at whether how leaders convey effectiveness differs depending on the level of remote work. Okay. So what we see here are the three groups of leaders based on level of remote work and the behaviors that convey effectiveness for them. So this is what observers associate with effectiveness in that group of leaders. So as you can see, there are, and this is important to look at, there are differences in how you would convey effectiveness if you work fully on site versus if you work 1 to 2 days or more remotely. So control, for example, has to do with following up with people and reminding them of their commitments to ensure that things get done on time. And that was associated with leadership effectiveness for those who work remotely, but not for those who work in person. Engaging in a high energy manner and creating high activity environments, or what is measured by excitement, is important for leadership effectiveness when you're working in person, but not when you're working at any level of remote work. There are also differences depending on level of remote work. So effectiveness At higher levels of remote work, what we see in the 3+ group is associated with empathy and less deference to authority, which is not something that we see in the more flexible 1 to 2 days a week. Uh, so there are some differences here in how to convey effectiveness. And we will continue to look at this in the coming months and share with you what we find with this group of leaders. But one thing that we noticed is that there are 3 behaviors: communication, strategic, and management focus, that show up as effective, or as related to effectiveness, I should say, for all 3 groups of leaders. And what's interesting about this is that we have been looking at these 3 behaviors for a while now. They seem to show up in a lot of these analyses. They seem to be associated with leadership effectiveness when we look at different cuts of the data. So much, in fact, that we started to call them the key 3. And that is the next thing that I wanted to talk about today. You know, so there are 3 behaviors that lead to effectiveness, and we want to show you where they show up, how often they show up, and perhaps what you can do in your practice to help leaders become more effectiveness just with these key 3 behaviors. So Tricia, I wanted to give you a chance to jump in if you wanted to say anything about the remote work research before I jump into the key 3.
I noticed we had a question which I thought was really interesting, Maria, around, so what about if the leaders in the office, but the staff is remote? So I'll start off with my thinking, and maybe you can jump in, because I was thinking that I think the core of what we're measuring is the leader is not physically present with the direct reports. So that would work if the remote was either way, right? That I don't get all, we're not physically together, and we have to communicate through technology in order to engage with each other, as opposed to sticking our heads in each other's office, catching each other in the kitchen or what have you. But then I was also wondering, because I know we're gathering this data on observers as well, I'm kind of wondering, well, if you're a direct report and you're at home, that is the mindset a little bit different. And so does that affect it when it's the other way? And I know we haven't looked at that yet, but do you have a hypothesis around that?
No, I think, wow, thank you for sharing that question. No, that is a great question. And we're definitely going to have to look at those interactions, because I think contact has a lot to do with it. And if you're working in the office, you're going to interact differently with those direct reports who are on site with you versus those who are working remotely. I think what we're going to know, my hypothesis is that distance is going to be a key factor here. And so regardless of who's working remotely, I think the form of contact and the frequency of contact may influence how leaders how leaders can be effective, and also which behaviors they tend to show with their direct reports. So it'll be interesting as we collect more data to look at both who's working remotely and for how often, but also those relationships, right? So is it the direct report who's working remotely? Is it the manager who's working remotely? So this can turn into a very interesting research tree where we have 10 different groups, and we can answer a lot of questions about how they are interacting and being effective as a group. No, that's very interesting. Thanks for that, Tricia. So let's jump into the key 3. So these are those 3 key behaviors that seem to show up in a lot of our effectiveness research. So to test this and to provide you with a more concrete example, we recently conducted a study of leaders in the US, and we separated them into different groups. Now, for each sample, we ran the procedure listed here on the right. But to summarize, leadership effectiveness was used as an outcome measure to determine which leadership behaviors are most often associated with effective leadership by observers. So it's the same analysis we have been talking about in a lot of the research today. Here's one example. So we looked at different time points in 2020, so the first and the second quarter of 2020. In both cases, leadership effectiveness was associated with 7 different behaviors. There was a different combination of behaviors for each quarter, but as you can see, these 3 were present in both cases, so strategic, communication, and management focus. If we look at different years, so 2018 and 2019, again, we see a variety of behaviors associated with effectiveness, but those 3 show up again as important for conveying effectiveness. We looked at men and women, male and female leaders. They convey effectiveness in different ways, but the ever-present strategic communication and management focus are there for those groups as well. And then one final set of examples, we looked at leadership by level and by function. There are some different recipes, you could say, for effectiveness, but again, strategic, management focus, and communication show up as important for conveying leadership effectiveness. So, these are a lot of recent examples of why, where these are showing up. They're showing up almost everywhere. Now, they don't show up 100% of the time. I want to make that clear. But it seems to be a pretty consistent triplet. The key 3 seem to show up in most of these analyses that we run. So over and over again, the key 3 show up. So what can we do with this? A safe bet is to assume that most leaders across contexts who want to be seen as more effective would probably benefit from increasing their emphasis on these key 3 behaviors. So if you know nothing about a leader or their context and you want to help them become more effective, not that that would ever happen, but let's pretend, you would perhaps want to start with these 3. It would be the safest bet to help them increase their level of effectiveness. So what exactly are the key 3? And I know a lot of you listening today are familiar with them, but I wanted to say, provide a little additional context for those who might know them less. So strategic. Strategic leaders or leaders who emphasize strategic behaviors consider the impact of their decisions. They understand the broader implications of their actions, and they think before acting, right? Take a step back, think before you make a decision, before you act. Leaders who emphasize communication are clear in how they communicate. They keep others informed, but they're also explicit about what they're trying to say and about their expectations. They're clear and thorough in what they're saying. So it's not just about communication, but the quality of that communication that they are providing. Finally, leaders with a management focus are willing to provide guidance. They actually seek opportunities to be influential, to take charge, and they're willing to take command, right? So they show that in a way, it seems like they're drawn to these situations where they can emphasize those behaviors and take command and manage the group or the team or whatever opportunity is available to them. So with that, I think we're doing good with time, Lucy, I believe. So we have some time for questions.
Great. Yes. So one question that came up about remote work, going back to that section, what are your thoughts on how we ensure reliable observer perceptions when so much of work is currently remote?
That is a good question. And, the way that the questions are written, you're given examples of ways that these different behaviors are expressed. But even in a remote setting, with all the communication that we have nowadays, right, Zoom or Slack or whatever Microsoft Teams, whatever someone is using, people are communicating. There is contact. There is communication between the leader and their managers or their direct reports or their peers, and given what we've noticed in with regard to pandemic research, not a lot changes, right? So leadership is robust, and so I think the effective leadership in any setting will have some core elements that are still easy to transmit via any medium. But we'll continue to look at this. And I think the question that Tricia brought up about, who's working where, and, perhaps we can gauge some level of contact that way. Uh, some information about level of contact will help us address some of those concerns.
Thanks. One more quick one before we move on. In the key three section, do those key three, do we see those not occur in leaders or companies that are unsuccessful or that have failed? And I know we don't collect data about company success or failure, but do we see those not, or have we explored that, see those not show up in leaders who are ineffective or unsuccessful?
That is a great question. So we haven't looked at it at the organizational level. Um, Tricia, do you know if it's shown up in the derailleur research?
So that's what I was going to say. So a couple of reminders for those who may be less familiar with us. So what we're measuring, we're always measuring leadership at an individual level. So all of the research that Maria is sharing is the aggregate of individual levels. And so when we ask effectiveness, we're asking how effective is this leader? And then we roll it all up together and see where the patterns are across these broader swaths of the population. So while these three often show up and associated with effectiveness, they thus far have never shown up alone. So there's always other parts of the behaviors that are seen in combination with these two that actually yield those higher levels of effectiveness. So that's one. Two, that when you look at the derailleurs, the only one that has that comes close to this one is one that includes management focus in it, and it's called My Way or the Highway. And it has high dominant, it has low empathy, it has low consensual. So when we look at leaders who are at risk or are failing, we don't see this three in combination in this way. So one, in order to be effective, you need more than these three, our research would say. And these three used in combination are never, so far, I shouldn't say never, so far in our research have never been a trio that's shown up in a less effective or a derailing leader. But again, I just have to say, I have such mixed feelings about this key three, because if you've been around us very much, we always promote the idea that there is no single right way to lead. There is no universal profile of leader that, ding, 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 hits all the bells. It depends upon what you're trying to achieve in the context you're trying to achieve it, and the resources you have available that allow you to work on the things that you're trying to create and the outcomes you're trying to bring forth. But what is interesting and can be very helpful is this idea that leaders who think before they act, this idea, particularly in a time, in a world that is very noisy, that the leader who makes sure things are understood clearly. And it also advocates for leaders who are willing to lead from the front when it's needed. We talk about leading from the front, leading from the side, leading from behind, but management focus says these leaders, when it's needed, are leading from the front. So good for us to know, and also be kind of tender and cautious about it. Over to you, Maria.
Thanks, Tricia. No, and I think to add to your point, they never show up by themselves, right? So there's more to the effective leader than just these key three. It's interesting that they show up over and over again, but they're not the sole driver of effectiveness. So we can't just focus on those and forget everything else. Okay, so our last research topic of the day is diversity and inclusion, and we're going to look at interactions between self and observer identity. Now, we have received a lot of questions about this that didn't start with the pandemic. It's something that we've been talking about for a while. We've researched it before, but we are now starting to dig a little deeper. And rather than looking at diversity and inclusion from a general perspective, what we wanted to do with this research was to take into account the identity of the respondents. Okay? So our goal was to see if there were differences in what inclusion looks like based on the identity of both the leader and the observer, right? So instead of saying, if you want to be inclusive, do this, perhaps we can, look at, so this is what looks inclusive to this group of observers based on their own personal identity. Now we're just starting to look at this in terms of race and ethnicity, but we have conducted similar research with gender interactions, and that is available. So I believe it should be in the knowledge base, but we're also able to talk about that and share it with you if you contact us. So this is an initial dive, but let me show you what we have. There's a lot more planned here as we will share. So this research involves a lot of combinations based on self-identified race or ethnicity. This is a few things to keep in mind. This is US data only because this is where most of our race information comes from. We are aware that the designations that we're using here are very US-centric, and we are having internal conversations to broaden how we measure diversity and ethnicity and race and all these different constructs. The current demographic item combines race and ethnicity, and because Hispanics can be of any race, there are Hispanics in the white group and the Black leaders group, but the distinctions between the groups are based on how people primarily classify themselves or how they identify, right? So these are self-reported based on how people perceive themselves in terms of these measures, of these factors. There are Asian leaders in the US sample. I want to make that clear, even though you won't see them on the list here. However, the sample sizes were too small to conduct the analyses. And so we were not able to do the same type of research with that group of leaders. Now, the sample sizes for non-white leaders is rather small, and that points to the need for a broader conversation about diversity in leadership. But that is beyond the scope of this presentation. We're sharing what we have based on the data that we were able to collect with the LEA. So now that we've covered that, let me show you what we did. So the LEA Observer Questionnaire includes a question about inclusion, and you can see it right there in that blue rectangle. We ask observers to rate how effective how effectively inclusive a leader is. Now we use that question as an outcome measure to determine which of the 22 leadership behaviors measured by the LEA convey inclusiveness or inclusivity to observers. So let's start by looking at what observers from different backgrounds or different identities associate with inclusion in white leaders. So what leads to perceptions of being effectively inclusive for white leaders? Now, there are some common behaviors that all observer groups associated with inclusivity when it comes to white leaders. First, it is being consensual, valuing and adopting the opinions and ideas of others, demonstrating empathy or genuine concern for others, placing less emphasis on self or using their own perspective and insights when making decisions, and emphasizing this generation of excitement and energy. Now, all observer groups associated that with inclusive white leaders. Now, for Black observers, there were some nuances. They also, in addition to those four, associated inclusion in white leaders with technical or using developing and maintaining professional expertise and using it to evaluate issues, showing a management focus, so being willing to take command and act as a facilitator at times, emphasizing communication, being clear and thorough in your communication, and being strategic, right? So thinking about the broader implications of your actions. Now, for Hispanic observers, there were two additional behaviors associated with inclusion in addition to the four, and that is being less dominant, forceful as a leader, and communication, which was also observed with Black observers. For white observers, the four were all that was needed to convey inclusion as a white leader. So no unique behaviors distinguish that group. When we look at how Black leaders convey effectiveness, there were some common observations that conveyed effectiveness to the other two groups, and that was empathy, self, uh, less reliance on self and being autonomous in your decision-making process, and or more emphasis on excitement. Okay. So all of these were present in the common observations for white leaders as well. Now, for Black leaders, there were no unique behaviors in addition to these three. And for white observers, both consensual and cooperation also signaled inclusivity in terms of Black leaders. We did not have enough data to run the same analysis and determine what Hispanic observers see as inclusive in Black leaders. And then the last group that we have is Hispanic leaders. And for that group, we had insufficient data from Black observers and Hispanic observers. So for white observers, Hispanic leaders look more inclusive when they are consensual, place less emphasis on self, show higher emphasis on cooperation, being strategic, empathy, communication, and then less emphasis on dominance. Okay. So there's a lot here. There's a lot to dissect here, but we wanted to share some of the overall findings. Okay, and I think the most important thing here is that inclusivity is in the eye of the beholder. Right, there are some commonalities, but there are also a lot of variabilities based on the interaction between the self and the observer identity. Okay? So what conveys inclusivity to one group of people may not convey it to a different group. And to add to this, we have to consider the identity of the person who is trying to project or convey inclusivity. However, there are some ways that seem to convey inclusivity across the board, or at least for the groups that we studied so far. So two behaviors convey inclusion across all combinations. That is higher empathy and lower self. So being more interested in the well-being of others and being and placing less emphasis on autonomy and making decisions independently. Another interesting finding is that there was one behavior that conveys inclusion when the observer is of a different identity than the leader, and that is higher consensual. So in instances where a leader is of a different identity, being willing to seek out input from others and being open to adopting ideas of others tends to be seen as an inclusive behavior. So what we've shared here is our initial dive into this. There are many questions remained, and we're just starting to look at this complex area. So one of the ways that we're going to answer more questions about this is by collecting more data. And we are very excited to share that we are creating a new diversity, equity, and inclusion questionnaire that's going to come to the LEA 360 very soon, and eventually the leadership culture assessment later this year. Now, we've written the questionnaire and we are testing it starting in February. So beta testing will be free to a limited number of users. We will be sharing with you how to use it if you're interested in using it. We'll keep you posted on the progress of this. But we want to test it. We want to make sure that it works. We want to start collecting some of these data, and then we will have the final version of it available in the LEA 360 and leadership culture assessments later in the year, later in 2021. So stay tuned for emails from us sharing a little more about this and keeping you updated on what's going on with it. So I think this is another good opportunity, perhaps for some questions. So Lucy, I will hand it off to you.
Yes, thank you. And thanks everyone for the great questions that are coming in. We probably will hop around a bit to play catch up on the Q&A here. So we'll hit a few of the different topics that we've covered. And let's start with one question about changes that we've seen in this pandemic time. Are there any indications that leaders have become more focused on short term during 2020? So increase in tactical rather than strategic?
So from the larger group data, we haven't seen that. We're not seeing any big changes in tactical. Of course, there's still time, right? And you know, we're looking at this in a quarter by quarter basis. So we will see if anything shows up in first quarter of 2021. But I mean, anecdotally, Tricia, I don't know if you've noticed anything working with individual leaders or groups of leaders.
You know, it's interesting. It's almost like the leadership brain has been bifurcated in this place, right? Because a lot of what I think we've seen in our coaching work is a combination of almost an emergency response, like how do we deal with this? But also there's been a lot of what I think we would call strategic pivoting. So people are having the conversation of, what will this mean longer term? Will people be working longer term? Will it change consumer buying habits longer term? Will our customers need different things? Is this, you know, so there has been this sort of duality in the intensity on both sides. So I wouldn't say that it's shifted all to tactical. I would say tactical has been a focus as people are trying to figure out, what do we do and how do we manage things day to day as family issues come up and technology challenges come up, but also a lot of strategic conversation around what does this mean over a longer period of time. So it's been interesting to watch that split.
Thanks. Hopping over to the key three section, just a question, Maria, about that research. Did those key three show up across observers? So direct reports, bot, peers, self, did that show up across all observers?
Oh, that's a great question. So these analyses use combined data. So we averaged out observer data weighted by observer group. But you know, we have looked at it in separate groups, and we do, you know, they show up in a lot of these analyses. But the data that we shared today is combined observer data. So it's all three groups put together.
Great, thanks.
I would just add to that, you know, we look at what is linked to peer and direct report levels of credibility compared to what the BOSS ratings of credibility with management. And these three show up in the peer and direct report level answer to the credibility question. I do have that factoid floating around in my head. While meanwhile, I can't remember my dog's name, but there you go.
A question, Tricia, I think that you might like to answer. Can you explain a little bit about MRG's plans for diversity and inclusion work?
Oh, that's such a great question. So, you know, a couple of things. One, I just want to emphasize that I really appreciate from a leadership perspective this evolution of the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And maybe oddly, maybe not oddly, it follows the evolution of assessments. So for those of you who've been working with assessments for a long time, you will remember way back when we only used self data, that there was some assumption that the self-perception of leadership was the perception of leadership. And then we moved to more general observer categories. There was a long period of time where, and it still actually happens, that people lump all the observers together. So let's just get a general rating on this leader based on what everybody else says. And then most assessment organizations moved to specific observer groups, right? Bosses, peers, direct reports, indirect reports, in some cases, even customers. But now I think we're really at a point in the evolution of leadership where we understand that much of the power of leadership is our leaders being able to lead the individual, to understand the individual differences of the people that they're trying to impact as a leader. So I think this is a really important juncture, certainly important at a larger society level and a larger organizational level. But I think it's a very important juncture when we're thinking about this at a leadership level. So in answer to what we're doing, so first we're trying to get our own house in order. That's one of the things we're trying to do. In the coaching and leadership development space, it happens to be quite around the world. It tends to be a very white community of practitioners. And so we are trying to grow in our diversity as we look at, in particular, welcoming and trying to be a welcoming place for a diverse set of practitioners to come. We do a lot of work in the humanitarian sector, as many of you know, and we're being really challenged with that to bring in coaches and consultants from what is called the Global South. And so that is Latin America, that's major regions of Asia, and certainly the Middle East and all the African countries. So we are working to build a more global community in our own community. From the work that we're doing supporting into the marketplace, our area of expertise is assessment. And so as Maria shared, we're really building our capability to support the gathering of assessment data at an individual leadership level, at a leadership team level, and at a leadership culture level to help answer the question, are we engaging as leaders in a way that builds an organizational world that is supportive of diversity, of equity and fairness, and of inclusion. And certainly that's not just for race, right? We at MRG are very grateful for the brave people who have put the racial justice issue back into the fore. But we are talking about all forms of diversity, equity, and inclusion for all types of people. And so that is, that's our assessment work, and it will be our assessment work, I'm sure, for many years to come. Over to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Tricia. Thanks so much. A lot more great questions in the inbox, some very specific to different parts. Do keep an eye out for the Q&A that we will send you. We love to answer all of these, and feel free to toss a few more in, or email us, or get in touch any way you'd like with more questions or comments. We're happy to address them, and we love hearing from you and engaging with you that way. But yes, I think we can move on. Maria, actually, you have a couple more things to just mention to folks.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. Just a few things. So looking ahead, in addition to that DE and I questionnaire that we're very excited to release soon and start testing, we are also updating our research topics. So as many of you who've been with us for a while know that MRG adds research topics to the LEA every few years. And we have selected the new set of topics that we're going to be adding this year. These topics help us expand our research and answer more contemporary questions, but it also provides coaches with information that is also more contemporary and can lead to significant and important conversations with their clients. So we're going to be adding the following, and you may have seen these because we did send out a survey to our wonderful client network and received a lot of good feedback. So we're adding psychological safety to the observer questionnaire, equity and team building as well. And the LEA self-questionnaire will include an item on imposter syndrome. So we look forward to seeing what fun and interesting research insights we can get from these. We're also, Tricia and I have been talking about this for a while. We share a lot of research. I mean, we love sharing research. We share a lot of it. But I think we also need to spend some time talking about how to use this research in practice. And we are planning, it's in the works, a workshop later this year about using research in practice. And we hope that it becomes an opportunity for us to share best practices, but also for the community and all participants in the workshop to share best practices for how to apply research in their practice. And And now back to you, Lucy, so you can share
Thanks.
some of what.
And I will, if you enjoyed today, I will put in a plug for our knowledge base. If you're an MRG client, you can search so much research. There's so much terrific work Maria and the rest of the team have done. So please do take a look in there, and you'll have a link to that in your follow-up emails as well, which will also include the slides, the recording. In a couple days, we'll have a webinar wrap-up blog with answers to your questions. We'll also in your follow-up email include highlights of 2020 research topics, some of which got touched on today in Q&A and other places. So that will all be there for you. And coming up with us, hot off the presses, we've just opened registration for our next webinar, February 24th. It's about coaching for career transitions, and it's going to be a great one with David and Drew. So registration for that is open now. And we have certifications coming up. If there are any MRG tools you don't have in your toolkit yet, do please join us. All of those, of course, are online, but highly interactive. And so we do limit the number of participants we have just to make sure everything's very engaging. So do get into those as soon as you can. I believe that will be all from us. Thank you for staying with us for 75 minutes today. We used every one of them. We appreciate you so much. Thanks for your questions. Do get in touch with any others that come to you, and we will see you next time.